So hi everybody, and welcome to another exciting episode of the AmBIssadors. I'm Vaneet,
And I'm Lo.
and today we're going to talk a little bit about bi history. Of course, we've spoken about this before in quite a few episodes, but we're going to be talking about a little bit of a timeline of how we've been involved in LGBTQ plus history and how that has shaped the way bi activism and bi history has changed and evolved. So, Lo, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I was
Where
going
do
to
you
say,
start?
I don't know about you, Vaneet, but I've definitely come across the stereotype a lot, or the myth rather, that bi people weren't involved in the struggle for like gay liberation, for queer liberation. Uh, it's definitely, I've seen it said that bi people have ridden the coattails of the gay movement's fight.
I think what I see a lot is that bisexual is new
Mm-hmm.
and it's like a fad. It's the new thing the kids are doing these days. And it's like, what is that true? No, let's talk about why.
I mean, even you and I, like, we're not kids anymore. And I know a lot of bi people who are middle-aged and older. It's definitely
Right.
not a young, trendy. Well, it is young and trendy, but it's not just that.
No, no, it's not. So I guess, we should probably start there with sort of gay liberation and the beginning of sort of pride movements and a lot of that stuff. So you've written a lot about history within your books. I guess you have a lot of information around that. And we've spoken about this before, but Brenda Howard.
Brenda Howard, the mother of pride. But I think if we're going to talk about pride and Brenda Howard, we should go back a little bit to kind of everyone knows, well, not everyone, but a lot of people now know the story of the Stonewall Inn and the riot there, which happened, I think, in 1969,
Yeah.
because the bar was being raided by police, as was quite frequent for those kind of bars. And then the patrons, is that the right word? Patrons?
Yeah.
Patrons.
Patron. Patron.
I've forgotten how to speak in lockdown because I don't see anyone.
Rude, honestly.
um, the patrons fought back against the police. And there's a lot of discussion about kind of who instigated the riot. Some people say it was Marsha Johnson. So some people say it was a black lesbian called Storm DeLavery. We don't really know, to be honest. Like, queer history has been forcefully and violently erased. And I
Yeah,
also,
I think when a lot of people talk about sort of the first person is through the brick or the first person that instigated it, I think they're erasing the main point, which is not like is this is not just one person, this was a community effort. And the important thing to note there is that trans people and black and brown queer people were at the forefront of that. And I think that's the important lesson to take out of any one person that was part of it.
yeah, do you remember that film that came out that invented like a white cis gay man and was like, this guy threw the first brick?
It's like, but not that. Like,
Yeah.
we can have one person. We can have those other. We can have other people. We're not gonna have this white cis gay man. Like,
Yeah, we can argue as much as we want about who it was, but the answer is not to invent some random white cis gay guy and be like, this guy did it.
yeah,
um, the gay rights movement had kind of was already around like by the time Stonewall happened. Some people say that Stonewall was like the start of the gay liberation fight. That's definitely not true. There was stuff going on like in the 60s. I think Donnie the Punk, who was bisexual man, he started the first what he called a homophile league, which was like we would call it just like an LGBT society now. He started that at his university in either 1964 or 1965. Like he started the process in 64 and then it became like a real thing in 65. And that's often argued to be like the first gay rights college group, at least, or possibly like the first gay rights group. But again, we don't know because so much of history has been erased.
There's probably so much other stuff going on that just isn't documented.
And again, this is like the history of the LGBTQ rights movement is so like Western focused. Like we say, oh, the queer rights movement started in the 60s. Well, it started in the 60s in the West, in America.
Yeah.
But there have been struggles going on for liberation, like in other parts of the world for we don't know how long, really.
Yeah. And like it's interesting when you talk about stuff like that, it's interesting to think about how these places were before colonization happened. And a lot of these places, there wasn't a sort of queer rights movement because actually there was nothing seen inherently wrong within queerness. It was kind of just a natural foundation, or was just a thing, like it was a completely different way of living in some places. Like you look at like the way the Hijra community was in India as an example of that. And a lot has changed since. And a lot of that is down to the colonization of those places. So yeah, it's a lot of history that we don't talk about. It's a lot of time very Western focused, and not even just Western focused, it's very focused on America, which is very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that like the fight against colonization and queer people who are fighting back against colonizers destroying their identity and kind of bringing in the anti-gay laws that we have in Britain that were just like exported all around the world. That's part of the fight for gay liberation, but yeah, it's not spoken about as kind of the LGBTQ rights history because it's not the Western history.
Yeah,
I think that's really interesting is the wrong word. It's something that I find fascinating, I guess is a better word.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people have spoken about how it sort of struggles, you can't really segment these struggles into sort of LGBTQ plus and women and trans and identity, like and non-binary identities and all of these stuff and racism and like a lot of people try and segment a lot of these things, which is why people try to talk about intersectionality a lot these days, which did start around Black women, specifically Black women, but have now sort of widened a lot into just discussing how you can't segment these things, you can't separate these things because actually there's a lot of people who will be part of both and will actually experience both and new extra struggles because of them, the fact that they're both.
Yeah.
But yeah, a whole divergence there.
No, it's really important. And like when we look at LGBT history, especially like the history of the word queer, and then what we're going to talk about a bit later of like the lesbian separation movement, those are kind of examples of like reactions to people trying to segment these fights. So like the word queer became reclaimed and popularized by Black and brown activists in like the 70s and 80s as a reaction to white LGBT organizations, which at the time would have just all been called like lesbian and gay organizations or just gay organizations. They were just wanting to focus on like white, middle class, cis gay people. And then these like Black and brown activists were like, well, hang on, racism is a big part of homophobia as well, a big part of queerphobia. And so is like classism and poverty and all this shit that a lot of like the mainstream organizations just weren't bothering to like tackle because they wanted to focus on like assimilation more than anything.
Yeah.
So the history of the word queer is like partially the history of that intersectional struggle.
Yeah. I have a lot to say on the sort of assimilation part, but I'll come down to that later. But yeah, and so obviously we're discussing, a lot of these places were actually called gay and lesbian, but there's an idea behind that gay and lesbian meant only gay and lesbian, and a lot of the ideas behind that is gay and lesbian have the same definitions now that they did back then, when actually, even to this day, a lot of people use gay as an umbrella term. But back then, it was used as an umbrella term on an individual basis as well. a lot of people, when they say gay, they didn't actually mean I am only interested in men. And it was the same thing for lesbian. And I know you've spoken about a lot about this and how lesbian wasn't just women who are only attracted to women, but it was more around the sexual act.
Yeah, so the word bisexual has only been in use since like the 1800s. And first of all, it was used to describe like plants that had male and female plants don't have genitalia. What's the word I'm trying to say? Male and female bits, you know?
Biology, I guess, yeah.
Sure. Like pollinators and things that receive the pollen. I'm not a plant expert. All of my plants have died over lockdown.
Oh no, poor plants.
And then the word kind of evolved to be used, like when it was first used for people, it was for what we would now maybe call intersex people. And obviously those terms have like narrowed and broadened, and that's a whole fucking thing anyway. But it didn't really start being used to describe sexuality until Freud used it in, I think, the 20s when he wrote his first book, or one of his books. And then it didn't start to like enter mainstream population really until like the 40s or 50s. And even then it was like very uncommon. So really the word bisexual has only started like catching on in kind of the 50s and 60s. And then the bisexual movement started like popping up in the 70s. But as you said, because there wasn't that word, or that word wasn't in common usage, people were gay or were lesbian if you had relationships with someone of the same gender. It was more something you did rather than someone you were.
Yeah. And a lot of people misunderstand that. So when people back from the sort of 50s or 60s or even the 70s and 80s say that I was gay, they see it as them affirming the fact that they were only interested in men or only interested in women if it was a woman saying that. And actually it wasn't used on that exclusive basis. And even to this day, like, you know, we would casually say gay. I would casually be like, yeah, I was so gay. Like, but it doesn't mean I'm gay, you know?
It's very much used as like an umbrella term. Like queer doesn't just mean same gender attracted. It can mean so many things. And so I kind of see gay and queer as being very similar in that way of having like quite a broad, like being an umbrella term, but I understand that a lot of people don't now, and that's kind of okay.
Yeah. I think a lot of people tend to not use gay as an umbrella term for the very reason that people are trying to erase people's identity from their past. Because if you end up using gay as an umbrella term, because it is an umbrella term and an actual term, people tend to misconstrue the two and go, well, if you're calling yourself gay, you're gay and you're then homosexual, rather than you can be gay and bisexual. You know, they don't. It's the confusion that comes with it. So people try to stray away from using gay as an umbrella term because it causes a very weird conflict and it causes a lot of erasure, which becomes a problem. But yeah, so when we're talking about how bisexual and the bisexual movement had an uptick in the 70s, a lot of that was in the reaction to the lesbian separatist movement, right?
Yeah. It's interesting, kind of several things like seem to happen at once, which is like, I guess, always the way when you look at history. It's never just like this one thing happened and then it caused World War II. It was like multiple things were going on. So San Francisco in the 70s was like the epicenter of queers. Like, it was when they
probably is at this point. Like,
yeah, legit, right? So several like groups popped up in San Francisco in the 70s, and there was even a place called the Bisexual Center, which I think opened in 71. I can't remember off the top of my head. But that was like, is possibly still the only physical space dedicated just to bisexuality. And it existed for like less than a decade in like the 70s. I don't think there is or have been, and please correct me if I'm wrong, like people watching, any other like permanent physical spaces just for bisexuality, which is, that's wild, right?
Completely insane. Completely insane.
If you think about, there's a lot of like gay venues, lesbian venues, LGBTQ venues, but there's only been like this one venue for bisexuality.
And especially when a lot of statistics show how much of the community we make up.
Mm-hmm.
And also it says how a lot of bisexual people don't enter the community. It's like, you've got 2 and 2. I'll just add it up and make 4, and you'll get it. You'll get it.
And it actually closed, interestingly, linking back to our video on the AIDS crisis. So this is one of my favorite stories from bisexual history. The husband and wife team who ran it got divorced.
Won't ever have a happy ending.
And both of them ended up focusing on like AIDS and HIV activism with like slightly different aims. And so they no longer ran the bisexual center in San Francisco. So it kind of shut down, partially because of their divorce and partially because of the HIV crisis, which I think is just really, really interesting, especially the part about the divorce. That's so funny. But yeah, so a lot of these groups were popping up in the 70s, and at the same time, what's kind of known as the feminist sex wars were happening, which is way less exciting than it sounds. It was basically like second wave feminism was having this identity crisis of like, are we pro-sex or are we sex negative? So like, do we want women to be sexually liberated and fucking everything and yeah, sex empowers women? Or are we, you know, trying to desexualize women to be seen as like people rather than sexual objects, but in order to do so, kind of discourage pornography and discourage to like sexualizing yourself and all this kind of stuff. So that was happening in the 70s, and then that led to what's called the Lesbian Sex Wars, which again is way less sexy than it sounds. But it was basically this like huge identity crisis of what does it mean to be a lesbian? But it was also partially like the bisexual movement was cropping up, and there was all these women who had been lesbians and were like identifying as lesbians who were now like, ooh, I think I'm bisexual. And then there was a big kind of identity crisis, yeah, within the lesbian community of, well, all these people are leaving because they're realizing they're bi, and also, like, are we bi? Who's bi? Who's lesbian? And at the same time, like, the trans community was becoming more visible, and that led to a lot of people being like, ooh, you can't be a trans woman and be a lesbian. I'm really oversimplifying here. Like, it was very academic.
Yeah. And I think this is why we've spoken a lot before about how biphobia and transphobia are very interlinked, because it kind of stems from the same place, especially when you talk about it in terms of women, because it all kind of stems back to lesbian sex wars and what is lesbianism. And a lot of it was seeing bisexuality and attraction to men as a threat. I saw like interesting text, which I cannot remember on top of my head, about this, and about there was a very famous woman who was definitely a transphobe, but talking about bisexuality. And it seems to be the case a lot. A lot of people who talk about the bisexual invasion of their spaces are transphobes. And so they're very much born in the same place.
I've written about this. I wrote an essay called Bisexuality and the Threat to Turf Politics, which is kind of a play on a great book that I recommend called Bisexuality and the Challenge to Lesbian Politics, which is like about this identity crisis. But this identity crisis is also where like the term political lesbian comes from. And that was kind of women saying, well, sleeping with men is sleeping with the enemy, and like putting female friendship and female love first is like the logical endpoint of feminism. So in order to like be a feminist, you have to be a lesbian. So it kind of gone from like the feminists pushing lesbians and queer women to one side because they're like, oh, you make us look bad. We're not all dirty man-hating lesbians. To then somehow it going to, you have to be a lesbian to be a feminist, because if you sleep with men, then you're sleeping with the enemy. And then somehow bi women are kind of caught up in this, being like attracted to women, wanting to sleep with women, but also, you know, being attracted to men. You kind of couldn't win on both sides, which is the bisexual experience summed up, in my opinion.
Yeah. And so this caused a lot of bi women to feel completely displaced from the community that they had not only been part of, but actually like helped push forward in a lot of ways. And it's actually where, like, let's not get into this massive thing again, but slur discourse, not only slur discourse, but also the butch femme discourse of who can use these terms comes from, because a lot of people enact bi erasure in a way, because they don't understand that actually the reason why lesbian is what lesbian is today is because of the fact that lesbians separate, like, forked off away from, and it wasn't even just forking away from bi people, but was forking away from LGBTQ plus in general, which is interesting because that is now being replicated today with Get the L Out and talking about the harm that trans people will cause to their community and what trans women are doing to their community. So it's the same story but played out over decades. And people don't seem to relate the two.
And again, I think it's important to point out that like in the 70s and 80s, when the feminist and lesbian sex wars were happening, this was also when the HIV crisis was happening. And we've talked a lot about like the biphobia in the HIV crisis. So again, like the part of the reason that bi women were kind of pushed out of this community that we'd always been a part of was like ideology of what does it mean to be a lesbian, but also the biphobia of, oh, well, these women are sleeping with men, and so they're going to infect us. So again, it's kind of like these two things were happening at the same time that kind of really pushed it forward, so it might not have if just one had happened.
Yeah. And that's the interesting thing is like, even back then, you could see how bisexuality was treated differently with different genders, because whilst bi women were visible to some level of degree, which obviously caused them harm, bi men were completely invisible. And it wasn't until the very, very famous news articles around the HIV crisis that we've spoken about that somehow, like, bisexuality was never talked about. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, viewers, but bisexuality was never talked about in mainstream media until suddenly they were like, who can we blame the disease on? And suddenly bisexual men were made hypervisible. And as we know, hypervisibility is never a good thing. People think hypervisibility is like, yes, look, all these people are right there in the front and center. It's like, actually, all that's going to do is cause harm. And suddenly bi men were hyper visible. And it caused a lot of people to go back in the closet because suddenly it's like, oh, there they are. They're the ones who we have to blame for the disease, and the torches and the pitchforks came out.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when we talk about this like separation, it's interesting because I'm really glad that the bi community became its own thing. Like, I think a lot of people make the mistake when we talk about like, well, this happened and it was kind of shitty and it like damaged the bi community a lot. We're not saying, well, I personally, I can't speak for everyone. I'm not saying like, I wish the word bisexual hadn't become popular and that we still use like lesbian, gay as overarching terms. Like, I love the bi community. I'm so happy it exists. But it is
I
important,
100% would you.
it's so important to like recognize how we'd always been a part of this fight. We just didn't have our own words and spaces yet. And
Yeah.
I think we still would have like created those, but in doing so, we didn't need to like be completely cut off from these communities that we had been in, which we were for like a while.
And that's the thing that's important, is that all the people within the LGBTQ plus community have their own spaces, they have their own events, have their own community. Right? There's a lovely trans community, and a bi community, and a gay community, and a lesbian community, and so on. But these communities are supposed to come together because multiple voices are louder than just one.
Mm-hmm.
And having these small marginalized communities come together to fight a bigger issue is so important. But so often when these communities come together, instead of harmonizing, they're clashing. And that's where the separatist problem comes into it. Because instead of acknowledging the fact that actually, because bi people didn't have their own space and community and word to congregate around, we were working with within the other communities and pushing the agenda forward together. That is a vase, and it's like, no, you're bi, so that is your community, and that's your space, and that's your lane, and it's not that simple. It's like there's a highway, and then you have the separate lanes of all of us, but we're all still part of this one thing, and a lot of this history is shared. You can't mark that down as lesbian history because it's categorically not. It's but like women love women history, if you want to try and clarify it or put it into a box, and say that it's separate from the men queer history. But you have non-binary people that are involved in that, and trans people that are involved in that, and bi people that are involved in that. It's just that they weren't so separate. But having our own community has been beneficial in so many ways.
I actually think, so interestingly, kind of another facet of the lesbian kind of sex wars and separatism movement was, now that like lesbianism at that time had become slightly more visible, a lot of people wanted to create like a lesbian history, which is great, so they were kind of, the metaphor I use is like reaching back through the archives and like claiming people, which needed to be done because like a lot of these women who were being written off as like, oh, she lived with her gal pal. Like they were queer women, they were lesbians, they were bisexual, but it was kind of maybe a little over enthusiastic. And it was kind of like, all of these women who've ever been interested in women are lesbians, end of story. And there was like no room for ambiguity and no room for like fluidity or bisexuality, or even for like trans men. Like if you look back through history, a lot of people are on this like line where they could have been butch gender non-conforming lesbians today, or they could have been trans men today. Like we don't really know how those people would have identified, but they were all just kind of claimed as, well, they were this.
Yeah.
And so there was this real fear that if bisexuals started being like, actually this one's ours, this one's ours, this one's ours, it would like diminish the power of lesbian history and of gay history. And I think personally that we're going to start to see that happen, and we're going to repeat our mistakes. We've kind of like, now that pansexual is a much more popular term than it ever has been, people might look back and say, well, actually, this isn't bi history, this is pan history. And I hope that doesn't happen, but I suspect it will, and I suspect we won't learn anything. And I suspect bi people are going to be like, no, these were all bi, go get your own icons.
Yeah.
And pan people are going to go, no.
Because that's the thing, is there is a lot of bi-pan solidarity, but there is a lot of people who create some sort of artificial wall between the two. And I have no idea where that comes from, because to me, I see a pan person and I'm like, great representation. Even if I identify as bi, like that is representation for me. But I think that's interesting as well, because a lot of gay and lesbian people think that someone being bi diminishes their history and takes away from them, because they don't see the value in bi history. And it's interesting because there's a lot of ideas to unpack there, because it's like, well, why do you think that? And you can almost guarantee that the root cause is something biphobic, because they see this person as less queer. They'll go, well, if they're bi, then they're basically straight. and that's where it tends to come from.
Yeah, they see it as a watering down of LGBT history, to acknowledge that maybe someone who had a wife who was a woman may have also, loved men.
And I think part of that is because of the way that non-queer people treat us, and they're angry at the wrong people, because they get angry at us instead of getting angry at the non-queer people. Because you'll see people like, for example, Frida Kahlo, where her relationships with women tend to get diminished as footnotes rather than actual stories, and they tend to focus on her marriage with her husband rather than the relations with women that she had. Because she had relations with a lot of women, like very famous women too, that were very important in queer history. Right. And it's interesting because I think that's where the anger comes from. They get angry at the wrong people. They get angry at the fact that someone who is queer disappears into straightness, and then get angry at us because we claim them as bi.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, well, that's the reason.
She also fucked Lenin, which is one of my favorite stories.
Honestly, a queen. I love her.
What a life. She was doing it all.
Bi people have had incredible lives. They just fucked so many famous people and did so much famous stuff. And it was just like, God damn, you really did that, huh?
I think that's a great way of ending it, Vaneet.
Yes. So happy LGBTQ+ History Month, everyone. Ooh. And we will see you in the next episode.
It's been a long episode, but thank you for sticking with it. See you next month, guys.
See you next month.